On democracy and societal agency. Reflecting on this past election, many dynamics surfaced, informing about how individual priority hierarchies impose influence on democratic outcomes. We were told the election was close by polls and media, but the reality is that the sentiment of the nation was much different than the messaging to the American people. Trump won easily and definitively, and this is just the reality. There is a prominent voice of America that demonstrated that they think things have gone too far in a bad direction and that a course correction is needed. The direction being prioritized by any single person can vary quite a large amount, but the net of all priority vectors netted out in Trump's favor. More people sense that the direction to pursue is down this path between the two options. This is essentially our society's search algorithm. Democracy is the mechanism in which our collective organism chooses a direction through civilization space, or however we frame the space of importance, based on sensing an aggregate gradient shift across all prioritization dimensions. Like an amoeba or some simple cell first moving through water, trying to collect sodium ions, this collective cell aims to steer and go in new directions based on the consensus result of a vote. And the mechanism of steering is choosing a new person and collection of values to be a captain. There are safeguards that protect against rogue pilots that wish to steer towards cliffs or hazards, Congress, courts, divisions of government, etc. This is all effectively agency control architecture, where the agency of this organism increases as we improve the methods of steering or navigating across n dimensions. So there could be evolvable low-hanging fruit in discovering optimal control setups that allow the organism to transform past a simple cell and become something like a slime mold or whatever more dynamic cell types there are, to eventually become a lineage branch to an animal kingdom of civilization-scale organisms and phenotypes. At the civilization scale, there may be an analogous kingdomization process, or the biologic domain splitting of bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Perhaps an analogous phenomenon is taking place that will lead to a distinction in lineage to other present populations and societal structure architectures. Democracy, as we have structured it, tends to necessitate two main parties that act as counterbalances to each other. When one side starts drifting too far in a direction that feels wrong to the majority, the pendulum swings back, offering voters two distinct options. These options are weighted by the net values of the population and the potential for individuals to gain power or advance personal interests. For instance, if a politician stands to profit from their position and become wealthier, their motivations will inevitably influence the direction they advocate. This has a positive weighting relationship as individual power grows, so the closer you are personally to the controls, president in the case of America, but all, positions like Supreme Court, Senate, Governor, FBI Director, etc., the weighting of your local goals becomes a larger representation of the organism's net direction choices. The two choices this organism can move towards every 4 years are colloquially labeled Republican or Democrat. Over a certain time scale, these labels are less meaningful or informative about the nature of a direction and instead delineate between the fact that a direction is different from the other. They are terms that persist as meaning Direction 1 or Direction 2. Where Democrat or Republican labels came about as compressed descriptions of the origin ideology, proposed direction, the present ideology has very little in common in a practical sense and may only apply as a catchphrase or slogan. In practice, the distance between these points in ideologic space is substantial, reflecting a large delta between the original and current consensus. Imagine a multidimensional space representing different ideological directions. Over time, the ideological positions associated with political labels like Republican or Democrat are not static. Instead, they change and drift. If we were to plot these positions as vectors in this multidimensional space, the distance between each vector and its original position at a starting point, let's call this starting point t equals 0, would increase over time. Formally, as time t becomes greater than 0, the deviation d from the original ideological vector at t0 also increases. This deviation implies that the ideological content associated with the label shifts over time. The time intervals for these shifts find alignment with the electoral cycle. Every election denotes a moment when we can reassess the ideological drift and reconcile the collective preference into a decided direction. If we are principled in a value, it should be expected to have to change labels as the pendulum is in flux and new directions are tested. Being a Democrat shouldn't mean the same thing today as it will in 30 years. If we tidily lock ourselves to the name rather than the direction preference, then we will be fated a destiny of hypocrisy across a long enough time scale. Something you disagree with today will be something you favor in the future, purely because the name it associates with has flipped. One of these anchor points seems much more functional in utilizing a collective intelligence's computational power. To the degree we freeze a signal pattern by a momentary affiliation to a label preference rather than dynamically computing direction preference each cycle, then the system will be much less aligned to what people actually think is the right direction based on their ability to reason about what they prioritize as important. In other words, the full collective intelligence was not exhausted. We left some collective IQ untapped. Maybe there are ways to purposely correct for this vulnerability. For instance, we could consider retiring direction labels based on a timescale that corresponds to the rate of ideological drift. By determining how long it takes for the ideological position, or vector d, to drift by a magnitude that exceeds an acceptable tolerance, we can set an appropriate interval for label retirement. Say that on average, every 20 years there is a certain amount of ideological shift x in d. For example, if we set our tolerance at a change of 1.95 times the original d, the time it takes for this level of drift to occur would guide when we should retire the label. Over time, as d changes, there is also an accumulation of h, a measure of hypocrisy. This hypocrisy represents the error in our precision of direction, growing as the label becomes less aligned with its original meaning. We will accumulate error, or h, as voter label affiliation becomes dependent on previous affiliation rather than on direction preference. Any improvements we make can be thought of as mutations that help our civilization stay competitive and persist in time. In an evolutionary environment, staying stagnant is a disadvantage and fated for doom. There may be pockets of form that can last for some immense time scale, but they will be constrained and limited. Think of the biological phenotype of an alligator or a squid. Sometimes a form factor and behavior suite is extremely stable and will exist no matter the external environment, but we shouldn't prefer this since it is a stagnant state. Assuming humanity wants to advance prosperity, accomplishments, and heights, then the thing we all comprise has to find mutations that advance agency. My intuition suspects this is going to involve adding more precise steering that increasingly aligns with some signal focal point amongst the collective hive mind. Then maybe once this is in place, the collective organism will be able to steer reliably in accordance to the collective consensus with higher resolution. This is very much gradient detection. Once we can accurately start stabilizing and smoothing out our movements and just learn how to ride the societal unicycle with greater finesse and competency, apply a force to each pedal or shift our weight to maintain balance, we unlock agency to deliberately steer towards our collective goals. Our actions become more deliberate in controlling outcomes and our agency grows. Society seemed to have flinched backward in this recent election, as if a bee sting triggered you to recoil your hand, or you suddenly stop and jump back as you realize you were about to walk into incoming traffic. The organism's hazard detection kicked in. It was the collective of all the voting nodes and their perception of current conditions being enriching, agreeable, or just a smell test. worse, same, better, and by how much. A lower worse to better value the net of society reports, the more drastic the lean away from the perceived current direction will be chosen, assuming the consensus mechanics haven't been compromised. Our controllability should ideally increase how many flinch directions the collective can compute and signal preference about. I see this being achievable in current democratic forms, where there are 2 direction choices every 4 years, to the extent that each direction choice becomes a higher parameter-weighted average. This allows for a higher flinch precision, just more focal points of force initiation. Then also, if there can be added direction choices. Instead of 2 potential next decisions, you now can consider 3. It seems this n equals 3 possible next state structure might need a different architecture than an n equals 2 democracy. N equals 3 doesn't seem to be possible in this current setup. Then can we try to answer what is the optimal amount of choices to practically navigate the dimensionality that affords us the greatest competitive advantage at positive economics? If we have learned anything from the American Revolution experiment, it is that the operating system is the source of prosperity. This is where the advantage lies. American democracy scratched the surface of a gold mine of organizational structures. There are likely lessons to be learned by what forms biology has found sustainable or advantageous. How many directions does a gazelle think about to jump once it spots a cheetah or some predator is leaping towards it? How many decisions does it consider and compute per period of time? Is that number always the same? Maybe if you are casually grazing a field of grass, the decision frequency slows. But after you narrowly dodge a cheetah and its claws scrape your back, decisions start computing much faster. Different times demand different competitively optimal amounts of attention and processing. The moments where you have to flinch backward probably align with a higher decision-making rate or perhaps other prioritization schemes. Maybe some focal point fluidity or narrowing, etc. There could be ways of structuring the societal scale control scheme, similar to the evolutionarily found processes we see at our own scale of organization. A fractal-like nature to a pattern in a lower abstraction might infer the pattern at a higher scale of interaction, repeating or expanding, condensing, twisting. However it continues, there are some things that extend through organization complexities. These fractal fragments could be extensions of some higher dimensional structure of form, maybe like cells in their own right or crystalline patterns through unknown dimensions of substrate. Other ways the universe can have structure or imposed form. Like a CT scan showing an organ one cross-section at a time, and with each frame, the image largely remains constant and only gradually deviates. These patterns seem to be out there, existing across scales of organization or process, and when we discover them, we can start building in a way that fits ergonomically to reality. It's like a rock climber finding reliable handholds while scaling a cliff. And with each placement, the climber clips their rope too. We anchor our form into the substrate of the universe more securely. Each anchor point becomes something solid to hold on to as we navigate the climb, helping us stay grounded in the real structure of reality. Think of boulders imposed in ways too abstract for us to understand or invisible to the thin slice of reality that we directly sense. But if one is in the way, no matter our will, we won't be able to walk through it. The universe has bends and constraints that are the final decider, and unless you build and structure according to those, a structure is guaranteed to have instability. Imagine these cross-scale consistencies as forms that the universe naturally favors, like the alligator, horseshoe crab, squid, and probably many others. These forms stick around because they align closely with the universe's conditional rules. They are more than just patterns. They're actual objects, abstract but real, holding stability and persistence. The universe seems to have these necessary shapes baked in, forms that everything gravitates toward because they work. Perhaps the humanoid primate form is the shape the universe typically arrives at down a certain length of a process. In an Alan Watts way, does the universe people everywhere at this scale of organization? People are a natural consequence down a long enough trail of combinatorial assemblage, or just running the program of what the universe does. The universe is the thing that makes people after Earths. And in the same lineage, it makes civilizations after people, which is a necessary form once people are reached. How will civilizations come to organize to manifest the next scale structure and organization? Checkpoints, or energy orbitals at the organizational scale. Stars, planets, cells, animals, societies, organization N, each a discrete level the universe adheres to until something big enough shakes us out like an Etch-a-Sketch being reset. Civilizations may move in discrete jumps, converting a burst of energy into a leap to the next level, or we risk falling back if we lose momentum. We are a lens focusing the sun's energy, and there are ways of focusing that will continue a natural flow or some that choose a headwind. There is always an aerodynamics that carves us to the right shape and that we are gradually finding. Maybe that's what a societal transition feels like to us, whether it's an election, a revolution, or a massive cultural shift. On our human timescale, these changes seem slow, like an entire lifespan. But from a higher abstraction observer's perspective, it may appear as if our society is an electron making a quick jump. Democracy is perhaps the beginning of some process that steers away from hazards and recursively starts approaching these anchor points in further dimensions. We can utilize the control patterns developed at more primitive organizational scales to inspire the forms we construct for the scale we collectively assemble. Beyond just control systems, there may be endless ways to find ergonomic adjustments, even improve beyond the primitive forms at scales foundational that had a constraint we don't that prevented it from utilizing a form. An airplane's jets rather than a bird's wing. We can optimize further, but it may be a useful and reliable guide. What cell's internal structure or operating system necessitates that it wakes up and recursively swells into a cavern of preferred form?